get started. Let me just pause the recording right now. There we go. All right, so today's session is obviously on action potential. I'll quickly review it because everyone is busy studying. So let's just get started right away. All right. You guys, everything working on the screen? Just to double check.
Yes.
All right, perfect. Obviously, if you have any questions, you can type it in the chat or you can open up your mic, whatever you want. All right, so I want to discuss what's the point of an action potential before we jump straight into it. So an action potential is a form of a message. So it's a form of a way where a message is conveyed to another party. Now, this is the way your body communicates with itself. Your brain can't understand regular messages, so it has to communicate in the form of electricity, which is action potentials. Anything that it needs to communicate needs to be converted to action potentials. For just like when you send a risky text, when you send a regular text to your friend, they all get converted to the same thing, and then they end up as messages. This is the way your body talks to each other, specifically your brain, and this is how it gets updated on information. It could be very important information, such as your current blood pressure, sodium levels, etc., or it could be unimportant information, such as your sensation of touch or maybe sensation of hearing. So, what exactly is an action potential? An action potential is, let me just move this out of the way. An action potential is a rapid sequence of changes across the voltage membrane. So basically, ions move in and out, and this causes changes in the membrane. And this is what action potential is. It's just ions coming in, ions coming out very quickly, and this in this direction in order to convey the message. And that's about all. And these changes in the membrane potential are what are used to send this information because it happens very quickly. This is why they're used. So this is just a visual representation of the action potential looks like. This is the similar point. So ions coming in, ions coming out, happens very quickly, and it goes in this direction. And they don't go back because of a specific concept we'll discuss in just a minute. It's about refractory periods, and we'll discuss it towards the end of this these slides. By the way, I'm using the same slides as Dr. Shawwaf's lecture. I just added a few for clarification. Are there any questions so far? No? All right, let's keep going. All right, so before we get started, I just want to discuss, the different types of ion channels because it'll make our lives easier later on. Is there any question? All right, so first off, we're focusing mainly on two types of ion channels. So we have ligand-gated channels over here, and we have voltage-gated channels over here. Now, these ligand-gated channels are the ones that respond to a binding. They have a receptor on them, and a molecule comes in, binds over here, and this either causes opening of the channel, which allows specific ions to come in, or the closing of the channel, which prevents ions from coming in. And this modifies the membrane potential over here. You guys are aware of membrane potentials, etc. I'm just going to assume you are. Yep. Okay. So the other form of channels are voltage-gated channels, which respond to membrane potential. So changes in the membrane potential either open or close these channels. So they could open to allow sodium out of the cell, to allow potassium into the cell. And these are the ones that are used in action potentials, so action potentials. And these are the ones that are mainly responsible for graded potentials, which I'll discuss in just a minute. These over here are called leaky channels or always open channels. These are responsible for establishing the resting membrane potential, Now, it's specifically the most important channel here is the potassium channel. It's called the leaky potassium channel, and it's the most responsible channel for establishing the resting membrane potential. I want to just ask something. Are you guys aware of the equilibrium potential, or do you need me to explain it?
Can you give it a quick review?
I'll review it in just a second then. What's the difference between action potential and graded potential? I'll discuss it in just a second. Yeah. So let's move on, because the difference between each other comes later in the slide. So I'll just postpone the question until then. Ligand-gated channels. Now, obviously, I discussed them earlier. They're opened by hormones, secondary messengers, or neurotransmitters. Basically, any molecule over here comes over here, binds, opens up a channel, and this causes a depolarization or a changing in the membrane potential. So what do we call it? When it binds over here, depending on number one, the molecule itself, in this case, in this example, they wrote glutamate, and depending on the receptor itself, these changes in membrane potential could either be excitatory or inhibitory. Now, in case of glutamate, when it binds to this NMDA receptor, which by the way is present on these neurons over here, it comes postsynaptically, which means after the synapse. It will open up a sodium and calcium channel, or basically a positive channel, which allows these ions to come in, which makes the cell more positive. And these channels, when they open, they generate a graded potential. It generates the graded potential. So opening up ligand-gated channels in the postsynaptic neuron before the trigger zone over here, which I'll discuss in just a second, generates something called the graded potential. So this graded potential, as I mentioned, could be excitatory or it could be inhibitory, depending on the type of channel and depending on the type of molecule that binds. I think that's about all you need to know here. You don't need to know anything specific. I would say know this specific example, like glutamate binds to NMDA, which opens up, which allows sodium and calcium to come in. But other than that, just know that ligand-gated channels are the ones responsible for establishing the graded potential over here. And I think that's about all from this slide. So I made a quick summary of what a graded potential is because someone asked me as well. So I'll clarify it here. So graded potentials are four things. Number one, they're local depolarizations or hyperpolarizations, whatever you want to discuss. It could be hyperpolarizations, which are basically making the membrane more negative. So this means that they only happen in this local region. Say a molecule or a neurotransmitter binds here. This starts a depolarization over here in this region of the neuron. It won't trigger depolarization anywhere else. It'll just spread. It'll spread this way, until it eventually reaches this point over here, which is the trigger zone. But it won't trigger depolarizations anywhere else. That means it is local and confined to this region, and then it spreads there and spreads from there. That's what that means. The next thing to be understood is that they can be summated or subtracted. This means that, let me clear the ink off the slide very quickly. There we go. This means that if you take a look over here, say this is a graded potential coming in from here, and this is another one from here. So let's say this has an arbitrary value of, 2. I don't know what 2 means in this case, but it's just, let's assume it's 2. And this has an arbitrary value of 2. And they're both positive. And they both come in like this, and they come in like this, and they get added up together to be 4. And they reach this point as 4. And this is what summated means. And obviously the opposite happens when we say that they're subtracted. That means, what do we call it? Say this was negative, these cancel each other out, and this becomes 0. And this is important in the way cells modify the type of signals that do get through and the ones that don't get through. So if a stimulus is very, very important, say there's a very important thing happening up there. For example, there's pain, and it needs to get the signal across very quickly and to trigger the action potential over here. It needs very, like, the stimulus will be much stronger and it will trigger the action potential over here, which I'll discuss in just a minute, by the way. And obviously, one last thing I want to discuss is that they're variable in size and amplitude. And this size and amplitude is dependent on the strength of the initial stimulus. So let me clear the ink again over here on this slide. What this means, get the pen again. I think I canceled the pen, get that back. I'm not sure if there are any questions. There are no questions. That's a pointer. All right, there we go. So what this means is that, say a lot of neurotransmitters were released over here, and they bind to a lot of channels over here. There's like a million channels over here. And this opens up these million channels, and this generates a very, very strong graded potential. And it spreads all the way over here, gets over here, goes to the trigger zone, and then it triggers the action potential downwards. That's a very strong stimulus. On the other hand, there could be very little true neurotransmitters released, There could be little graded potential and it reaches this point, but it doesn't trigger the action potential. This is what this means. So these are basically, this is what a graded potential is. These are its properties. Now, I'll clarify it much further over here. Now, a graded potential is like a wave of depolarization. Again, it needs to reach this trigger zone at a specific membrane potential. This specific membrane potential is known as the threshold potential. Well, I'm not going to write it because I'm writing with the mouse, but it's called the threshold potential. This threshold potential is, in this case, about -55. If the graded potential was strong enough to reach this point over here, and it causes a depolarization that's -55 or more, it'll trigger an action potential. Well, it's on this side over here. This is how a graded potential works. Now, there are two types of graded potentials, as mentioned on the slide. There is a sub-threshold graded potential, and there's a supra-threshold graded potential over here and over here. What sub-threshold means basically is that the stimulus was not strong enough to reach this point to trigger the action potential. And what a supra-threshold means is the opposite. It was very strong. It reached this point. The depolarization in the membrane over here was sufficient enough to trigger the action potential. E is the, what do we call it? So a graded potential causes an action potential. Yes, that is correct, Siam. Is the trigger zone in the axon hillock? Yes, a trigger zone is known as the, like anatomically, it's known as the axon hillock. This is the anatomical name. The functional name is known as the trigger zone. That's the only difference between these two names. So over here, as mentioned on the slide, a graded potential is short distance. An action potential is long distance. And that's one main difference between them. There's other differences I'll discuss in just a bit. But what, again, subthreshold means it doesn't trigger the action potential because there's not enough depolarization over here. Over here, there's not enough depolarization to trigger it. Say here it says -55, say it was -60 when it reached this point. It will not trigger an action potential. Over here, it's -55, the graded potential, sorry, the threshold. Say the graded potential was -40. Well, -40 is larger than -55, and this triggers the action potential at the trigger zone. Now, I want to discuss why is it called the trigger zone? Well, the trigger zone is called the trigger zone because it has voltage gated channels. There are no voltage gated channels at any place in here. There's no voltage gated channel, none at all. Not in the cell body, not in the dendrites, none. If there were voltage gated channels, that means that the current, the graded potential, would be an action potential at that point because it will trigger the release of everything. What about the graph on the left? What graph? The subthreshold? What exactly do you want from the subthreshold graph? 1 second. Let me just clear off the ink off the slide. It's getting a bit chaotic right now. Is it not above -55? It's not above -55. It's -60. -60 is less than -55. Where is the action potential? The action potential starts over here at the trigger zone. It starts over here. This is where the action potential starts, and it goes downwards down the axon. The axon is the long process of the neuron. It starts here and it goes down. There's no action potential over here. None. No action potentials in the cell body. Shamoon, the action potential gate. The first one is near the dendrites, not where the action potential generates. Sorry, I don't understand what you mean, Ariba. In the first one, so there are only ligand-gated channels in the dendrites that generate graded potentials. Yep. Okay, yeah. There's only ligand-gated channels that make graded potentials over here. No action potentials in the cell body, none. The action potential gate, it starts over here. I guess that's what you're asking about. The action potential starts over here in the trigger zone and it goes all the way down, and it's full, and it's directed by voltage gated channels. I'll discuss it a little bit further once we move on with the slides. So I think this is clear, so I'll move on to the next slide. Now, okay. Let's see. All right, there we go. So I want to discuss before If the graded potential reaches the threshold, they cause action potential. Yes, once the graded potential reaches the threshold in the axon hillock, it will cause a graded potential. I'll discuss it over here again. So say you are thrown in some random city with $100, okay? You have $100 on you, and you need to get to the train station over here to take you to the next city. And you can only Uber with this. So depending on the traffic over here, depending on the traffic and the state of the road, that ride will cost you more money. If you spend way too much money trying to get there, you will not be able to take the train and you will not be able to go to the next city. This is exactly what a graded potential is. It's just a depolarization, moves through here, and then the train station is your trigger zone, and then you go over here to the other side. This is what it is. And obviously, if the roads are clear, then you can get to the other side very easily. All right, so here I want to discuss why graded potentials dissipate. So graded potentials decay. What this means, imagine a graded potential. I want you to imagine in your head a graded potential as a water droplet. We drop a water droplet in a pond or a body of water, and there's waves that spread out from there. At the very beginning, where the water droplet fell, the graded potential or the wave was very strong. As it goes further, it starts spreading in every direction and it starts to fizzle out. And this is how graded potentials work. They just fizzle out. Like they start over here and they start moving here, here, they go everywhere. There's no specific pathway they follow. No specific pathway, just fizzle out. And this is how graded potentials decay. It's known as leak, the leak of a current or the decay of a current. And what do we call it? This decay can be, numeralized. We can put it in the form of a variable known as the length constant. Now, I want to clarify the length constant. Over here, it says that the length constant is the graded potential that has decreased by 37% of its original amount. Cool. But now I want to explain it just a little bit further. So say this is our graded potential over here. I'm going to make a quick graph, okay? This is x-axis, y-axis. Say this is distance over here, and this is potential, graded potential. Say the graded potential goes all the way up here, all right? And then it starts going down. It goes down until it reaches back to whatever value it started from. Now, at this point over here, it's at, say, this is the 100% point, 100%, and this is the 37% point. Now, the point at which, or the distance it traveled, in order for it to be 37% of the original amount, is known as the length constant. And that's it. That's what the length constant is. It's just the amount of distance traveled until the graded potential has went down from 100% to 37%. And that's it. And obviously, the larger the length constant, the more it travels. It means that this, until it reaches 37%, it travels much, much longer. It can go further and further. And as the length constant goes down, it can travel less. And basically, what this means is that the length constant is a reflection of how powerful a graded potential is. It's how powerful the graded potential is. The larger the length constant, the larger the graded potential. And yeah, that's about all for the length constants. Is there any confusion about it? Any problems? No? All right. And obviously, if the graded potential is strong enough, it can reach the trigger zone and start an action potential. And I'll discuss that in just a second. All right. So over here, I have a quick example. Say you pull up to your local neuron store and you buy a neuron over here. And what do we call it? You want to measure the length constant. So obviously, there are two ways. No, it does not apply to action potentials. Action potentials are constant. I didn't understand this. If it goes down to 37, action. No. It's not about, what do we call it? It's not about if it goes down to 37%, it won't trigger the action potential. It's just some number we assign. It's just a random number, random variable we assign to see the strength of the graded potential. This doesn't mean that it won't trigger the action potential. It could trigger the action potential, but not necessarily. This doesn't mean that if it reaches 37%, it won't trigger the action potential. So the length constant, basically what this means is if this thing goes down, if this thing is down, it means that the strength of your graded potential is less. That's all it means. It doesn't mean that it won't trigger or does trigger. That does not, it doesn't mean that. Is that clear? All right, great. All right, say we have a neuron over here, okay? And say we have a graded potential that we generated over here. Now, there are two ways in which the graded potential, gets, so basically, yeah, it depends on the strength. So there are two ways that graded potential dissipates or goes away, or is like its strength is lessened. Number one, it spreads, so it goes in every direction. It goes here, 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 here. And the second way it gets interrupted is by things in the way. Well, take a look over here. There are organelles in the way. It needs to bypass these organelles, so it loses some of its strength. There's a whole nucleus over here as well. It gets in the way, so it not necessarily reaches over here. Doesn't necessarily reach over here. So these two things are what determine the strength and how far the graded potential will go. The resistance, or the cytoplasmic resistance, and the dissipation or the decay. How much does it spread apart? These are the two things that determine how strong the graded potential is. Now, say over here in this example, a graded potential, let me clear the ink again, so it makes it easier. So over here, say this is the graded potential. Say it reaches all the way over here. This is the point where it reaches 37% of its original amount. Say this is 100% over here. This is the point where it reaches 37%. So this is the length constant. This is the distance it traveled. Now, in this other neuron, this is the distance it traveled before reaching 37%. Now, which graded potential is stronger? This one or this one? Yep, it's the second one because it traveled, stronger. The second one, the graded potential, is weaker because it traveled less distance. Yep, the first one is the one that's stronger because it traveled more. There's more travel. In this one, it traveled less and then it dissipated. This is all what length constant is. It's just showing how strong the graded potential is. And that's all. Is everything clear? Yeah, happy neuron, sad neuron. All right, and I guess I'll move on to the next point. All right, so now that we've talked about graded potentials, it's time to talk about action potentials. So action potentials, can you clarify the 37% again? All right, so I'll do it one last time. So we start at 100%. I'll tell you again in just a second. So you start at 100%, you reach 37%. So this is graded potential. You start at 100%. Let me do it here. You start at 100%, and one strength, 100% strength, amplitude, whatever you want to call it, strength. It goes and travels. The point at which it reaches 37% is called, the distance it traveled until it reaches 37% strength is called the length constant. The length constant. I can't type. It's called the length constant over here. You can see it right here, length constant. And the two factors are, number one, decay or leak. Number two, cytoplasmic resistance. I'll send the slides, by the way, to you guys. Resistance. And there's a recording as well. So yeah, you can check it out as well after. And let's see. All right, so again, an action potential is a rapid sequence of changes in voltage across a membrane. The more the length constant, the more chance to get to the trigger zone, right? Yep, that's correct. So over here we have an action potential. Sorry, what am I saying? Over here, action potential is a rapid sequence of changes in the voltage. So things change quickly over here. Things come in, things come out, and this generates an action potential. We'll discuss it in just a second. So before we discuss action potentials, I've been talking about voltage-gated channels for quite a while. So the voltage-gated channel is what generates the action potential. So a graded potential, to review, graded potential is ligand-gated channel in a neuron. In a neuron, it's ligand-gated channel. In in the same neuron, a voltage-gated channel is what's responsible for generating the action potential. Action potential. And these voltage-gated channels are only found over here in the trigger zone and whatever left of the axon, the entire axon. So the trigger zone and the axon. This is where voltage-gated channels are. They're not over here. They're not over here. They're just here. All right. So voltage-gated channels. So we have activation gates and we have inactivation gates. Now, when we reach a specific voltage, so when we reach a specific voltage known as the threshold voltage, these channels open. They open through an activation gate. So there's an activation gate over here. Once it reaches that membrane potential, over here it says -55. It depends on the type of cell and what's going on. What do we call it? Once it reaches this point, this triggers the opening of the channel through the activation gate. So there's something called the activation gate. Once it opens, it allows ions to come in. In this case, it's sodium. And sodium, when it comes in, it causes depolarization of the cell. It makes it more positive. More positive. Positive from the outside. This is outside, out, in. When positive ions come to the cell, it makes it more positive. And this is what starts the action potential. Now, once these ions come in, they start coming in, and they cause the membrane, they cause the cell to become much more positive. There's a point where it reaches a specific positivity where it triggers something known as the inactivation gate. This inactivation gate is this over here. If you take a look over here, this is the inactivation gate. It closes. That means it shuts down the ion channel. It's like, whoops, it's inactivated. This does not mean that the channel is closed. It means that the channel is inactivated. There's a difference. A closed channel is one that is one that is as if it's at rest. This is not at rest yet because it's at a high voltage. It's only inactivated, and it's inactivated by the, what do we call it? By the inactivation gate, because it reached +35. Now, at the same time, once we reach a very high voltage over here, at +35 in this case, potassium channels open. These potassium channels are also voltage-gated channels. They open up at higher voltages. It's just how the channel is. Once it reaches positivity, it causes the channel to open. Once the channel opens, this allows potassium to move out. When potassium moves out, it makes the cell much more negative because you're losing positivity. You have positive over here, you're losing it, so it makes the cell more negative. And this is why it pushes back the membrane potential to the negative. Once it reaches a specific point, about -70, -80, the channel closes again. Here's a question. Does sodium still come in during inactivating? No, there's no sodium coming in during inactivation. No sodium. I'll repeat what happens with sodium and potassium in just a bit. Because we're going to repeat it a bunch of times during the slides. This is just to start us off. So I want you to think about action potential, 2 channels. Very important. Potassium channels, sodium channels. These are what drive an action potential. Potassium channels, sodium channels. That's all that matters in action potential. And we'll discuss how they open and close again in just a minute. All right, so the most important thing, sodium channels, potassium channels. Now, this is just to clarify the inactivation gate again. This bouncer over here, the meme. What do we call it? Inactivation gate over here. This is the inactivation gate. This is inactivated. It doesn't mean the channel is closed. It means it's inactivated, okay? Inactivated does not mean closed. I want to make that very clear. Inactivated is not the same as closed. Not the same as closed. Closed, they both states don't allow sodium to come in, sure, but they're not the same. They're not the same state. This happens after sodium comes in. This happens at rest. This is at rest. This is after sodium comes in. This is the difference between them, and it's important to this is important. I know it may seem a little bit repetitive. It's like, where's there an inactivation gate? Why doesn't it just close? It's important when discussing specific drugs and how they work on these channels. you'll take it later on. Either way, let's discuss the properties of an action potential. And they're different than graded potentials. Action potentials are different than graded potentials in the way where they're all or none, meaning once it happens, it won't stop. It's unstoppable. Once an action potential is triggered, it will not stop. Once over here, the trigger zone, you see the trigger zone? Once it reaches threshold and the action potential is triggered, it will travel down the axon and it will continue downwards. It will not stop. This is what it means, all or none. And the threshold is usually about 15 millivolts higher than the resting membrane potential. This is all this means. Second is that they have a constant amplitude, meaning that unlike graded potentials, which we discussed earlier, graded potentials, I mentioned that they have different strength depending on the number of neurotransmitters, and they can add up and they can be bigger and smaller and smaller. These are graded potentials. Action potentials don't have that. They're one amplitude. Take a look over here. They're the same amplitude. This is the same. This is the same. This is the same. They're all the same. Regardless of the stimulus. Take a look at the stimulus. We have a very strong stimulus over here. Triggers the same action potential as this stimulus over here. It's the same. So this is what constant amplitude means. There's a bunch of things in chat. Hang on. Let's see. So are inactivated going to become activated again? Yes, Siham, they are going to become activated again once the potential becomes negative again. They become activated after the potential comes back to resting membrane potential. What's the green structure in the inactivation gate? Let me take a look here. This is the green structure. What are you talking about? Do we have to memorize the numbers? The cytoplasmic resistance. No, only graded potential. All right. Cytoplasmic resistance and decay are only for graded potential, not for action potential. What is the threshold exactly means? So the threshold is the point at which these channels will open. The point at which the voltage gated channel will open. This is the threshold. And someone mentioned numbers. I don't think you have to memorize numbers, but I would still know the ones that are bolded. For example, over here, I would still know, about -55, here about +35. I remember in my exam, they used to give it to us, but I would still memorize it just in case. You never know what they pull on you. The green ball, I don't know. This is a diagram I got off the internet. So it's just the thing that plugs the channel. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's not very important. Anyways, so this is the action potential. These are its properties. Now we'll discuss how they propagate. All right, so I mentioned earlier, this is just for your information. You don't have to know this. I'm not sure if you've taken it. So we mentioned that action potentials have the same, amplitude. They're not higher or bigger or smaller or larger or whatever. However, action potentials are more frequent. I think it mentioned earlier over here, information is coded by frequency, not amplitude. So I added this slide to show you that when it's more frequent, that means the message is more important. There are more action potentials happening, but it doesn't. But each action potential is the same. There's nothing different from this. This action potential is the same as this action potential, the same as this action potential, the same as this action potential, and so on and so forth. The only difference is that it happens more often, and this is all it means over here. All right, so this is just to show you that the action potential is like a train. It's unstoppable. If anyone got that reference, great, whatever. Ionic basis of the action potential. All right. What time is it? Let me check. All right, we have time. All right. So the most important thing to know about action potential is sodium and potassium. That's all you really care about. You don't care about none of these. I don't care about any of this. You just care about these two, as mentioned over here. Now, we know that sodium over here, sodium is present outside the cell, more outside the cell. And potassium is present inside the cell. Now, now just a quick question, just a quick review. What makes them outside and inside? What makes sodium outside and potassium inside? Not the high concentration, channel permeability, ion gated channels. It is a pump. It's the sodium potassium ATPase that establishes this gradient. It doesn't establish the membrane potential, but it helps establish like the sodium outside, potassium inside. It's the sodium potassium pump. All right. I'll revise it in just a second. I'll revise the resting membrane potential in just a second. All right. So over here is just brought up basic, what do we call it? Basic electricity. I don't know why they put the slide every year, but just memorize it. Potential V, current I, conductance G, resistance R, whatever. Let's move on. So this is what matters to me over here. This over here. This is Ohm's law, which is the same as the one mentioned over here. This basically means current is equal to voltage times conductance. Current means, things moving, the ions moving in and out, how they move. Sodium coming in, potassium coming out. This is what current means. Voltage is the difference in charge. So how far apart are like the charges? Is it more negative, more positive? It's what pushes the ions. And conductance, or G over here, kind of like, masked it a little bit, but let me just show it again. G, I'll use a laser pointer. G over here means conductance, and conductance means the number of channels that are open. That's all it means. Number of channels open. Conductance. How easy for how open or how easy is it for ions to come in? That's all that conductance means. Now I'll discuss it even further in just a second. That's it. So this equation is the same equation as the last one. This is the same as this. You don't need to discuss resistance too much. You don't need to know much about resistance. It's just how it's just part of the formula. We'll be focused more on conductance over here. Let's see. Let me just switch back to pen. All right. So this formula is the same as this formula. It's just in ions. This is in electricity or fluids. This is in ions. If you take a look over here, this is conductance. This is the membrane potential, and this is the equilibrium potential. I'll revise equilibrium potential in just a second. Conductance. Conductance is the number of channels open, like how many sodium channels are open channels. For example, the resting membrane, this is the membrane potential. You know what that is. This is just the potential at rest. The equilibrium potential, I'll revise right now. Let's take a look over here. I'm sure you've seen an example that's similar to this one. So the equilibrium potential, say that there's a sodium potassium ATPase over here, ATPase, whatever, that stuff. All right. So what do we call it? Or pump, just to keep it clear, pump, whatever. Establish this concentrations. Now, potassium, if you take a look, there are two variables that, what do we call it, that are responsible for the equilibrium potential. Number one, the chemical gradient. Now, we know that things, when we have a lot of the same thing on the same side, it kind of wants to diffuse to the other side. It wants to move this way because there's just too much potassium over here. At the same time, as these potassiums leave to the other side, say there are channels for potassium over here, as they leave to the other side, as they go this way, it creates a negative charge over here, negative. Why? Because we're losing positive. This positive over here is going to this side. This positive over here is going to this side. This positive over here is going to this side. At some point, this side over here will be so negative that the potassium, despite being higher amounts over here, just won't move out. It won't move out because there's just too much of a negative charge. It's pulling back the positive charges in. It's pulling them back. And that's the point where it's called equilibrium potential. The reason it's called equilibrium potential, is because the chemical gradient, chemical is equal to electrical. That's it. And the whole point behind this, why do we need to know this? Why do I need to know what an equilibrium potential is? What's the point behind it all? The whole point behind it is to see where the ions will move. That's it. To see how much it'll move. Like, will potassium move to the outside? Will potassium move to the inside, etc. That's the whole point of equilibrium potential. Like, to see where the ion will move. How do you calculate the equilibrium potential? I think there was an equation. I don't remember. I haven't revised that the specific lecture. I think it's called the Nernst equation. Nernst equation. I think it's in the previous lecture. I'm not sure if you took it. If you did not take the Nernst equation, then you don't have to know how to calculate the equilibrium potential. If you did take it, they'll give it to you in simple numbers. I'm not exactly sure what the equation is, so just take a look at that other lecture and you can calculate it from there for every ion. So every ion has its own equilibrium potential. And the same happens for sodium. Sodium wants to move this way, it gets dragged the other way. I'll repeat the concept. Just give me a second. Again, equilibrium potential. I'm just explaining concepts. I'm not explaining any equations. I'm not explaining any numbers because that's part of the previous lecture and I'm not sure of the equation. That's why. You can take a look at it again. So potassium, and there's an ATPase over here for a pump. The pump is what made them in this position. This is what made potassium be more here, and this is what made sodium be more over here on this side. That's it. That's why they're like this in the first place. Now there are potassium channels that are leaky. They're known as leaky channels, and there are sodium channels that are leaky, but they're little. Yep, I think that's the equation over here written in chat. If you want to remember it, it's right there. All right, so potassium, because there's more of it over here, it wants to move this way. It wants to move this way. Think about it as if you're putting, what do we call it? Salt or a cube, sorry, not salt, a cube of sugar in water. You know how it wants to spread further apart, something like that, dissolving? Think about it that way. It wants to move this way because there's so much potassium over here. There's a chemical gradient. It wants to move to this side. But at the same time, as it moves this way, 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 why is potassium, sodium not even on both sides, even though they're both on? Why is the potassium and sodium not even both the sides, even though? Because of the pump. The pump is the most important thing in establishing this gradient. The sodium potassium pump. Sodium potassium pump. This is the main reason. Sorry, what are you guys typing in? Outside, inside. Yeah, I think I didn't clarify. This is inside, inside, outside. There we go. Outside. All right. There we go. Oh, you guys are talking about the equation? Oh, never mind. All right. Okay. So yeah, this moves in. There's a chemical gradient over here. There's so much potassium, it wants to move to this side. But as more potassiums go over here, there's more. This makes a negative current over here. There's a negative charge over here. Why? Because more positives leaving. Every time a positive leaves, it becomes more negative over here. Every time a potassium leaves, it becomes more negative. There's a point where I think it's around -90, I'm not sure, -98, something like that. There's a point where this membrane becomes so negative that potassium will just not leave because it's a positively charged ion. It will be attracted to the negative side. So it's like, nope, I don't want to go to this side. That's it. I'm happy over here. That's it. This is what establishes, this is the equilibrium potential of potassium because it wants to move this way, but the electricity is pulling it back this way. So there are two forces. It's called, one of them is called the chemical gradient, and the other one is known as the electrical gradient. And they're opposite to each other. Let me erase it. So the chemical gradient is always opposite to the chemical gradient is almost opposite to the electrical gradient. Is the recording going to be uploaded? Yes, it will be uploaded. All right, so I want to move on to the next point since we're focusing on action potential. You can revise this through your lecture or you can take a look at the recording later on because we don't have much time. So here he just explains the equation we discussed earlier. Remember this one? I equals V times G. This is the same over here. This is just showing that I think it's just it's giving some values. This is the equilibrium potential of sodium. This is the potassium. This is sodium. And we gave a hypothetical scenario over it in some cell, in some ideal neuron, as Dr. Shawaf mentioned. So what do we call it? at rest, say that there's no channels that are open right now. Nothing is open. There's potassium over here. There's a lot of potassium inside, and there's a lot of sodium outside. This slide is not, look, the slide itself is not very important. It's not, honestly speaking, it's not a very important slide. It's just conceptual. You don't need to know much about the slide other than the only thing you need to know is that, yeah, it's just for concept. The main thing you need to know is conductance. Conductance is what drives the, what do we call it, the movement of ions and the voltage difference. This is all it's showing. But the slide itself, you don't need to memorize values. You don't need to do any of that stuff. And none of that stuff. Just understand the concept behind it. So potassium's inside. Potassium's inside, sodium's outside. And there's no connection. So that means that if there are no channels that are open, G is 0. G is 0. And 0 times whatever this number is 0. That means there's no movement. That's all it means. This is 0 times, say, I don't know, 50, for example. It'll be 0. There's no movement. There's no current. This is all it means. There is no current. If we open up a channel for for potassium, the conductance of potassium rises. So this no longer becomes 0 over here. This is no longer 0. It becomes, say, +2. And the difference in voltage is, say, I don't know, -30, for example, or something like that. It doesn't matter. Whatever it is, +30, -30. It gives us a number of 60. Well, this 60, it doesn't matter. These numbers don't matter at all. This 60 is the movement of the current. So ions are moving. That's all it means. This is what I stands for. That means, oh yeah, things are moving around. At some point, I think it's in the next slide. Let me move on to the next slide. At some point, I think it mentioned over here, it's 0 because it's impermeable, whatever, yada, yada, yada. It becomes more, the conductance becomes more than 0 because potassium channels are open, and this allows potassium to go up. Now, at some point, the membrane potential is the same as the equilibrium potential, what do we call it, of sodium. That means when, of potassium. When potassium keeps moving out, 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 this makes the membrane potential, Vm, approach Ek. That means the membrane potential is the same as the equilibrium potential because that's where potassium is taking it. It's taking the membrane potential towards the equilibrium potential. When it reaches that point, when they're both equal to each other, if you take a look over here, that means that there's no net current because there's no difference in voltage. Because if you remember the equation, it's Vm minus Ek. And if they're both the same number, say this is 2 and this is 2, they're equal to 0. And then that times the conductance, G, ion, whatever, is equal to 0 in the end of the day. That's all it means. G will be mentioned in the question. Yeah, it'll give you G, don't worry. It'll give you, like, most likely, if this were to come a question, I'll give you 3 values. It'll give you like G, ion. It'll give you like equilibrium, the equilibrium potential, and it'll give you like the membrane potential. It'll ask you to calculate what the current is. That's if a question were to come from you. That's it. You'll be given these 3 values, and you'll have to find the third one, or the other way around. But inshallah, it'll be all straightforward. It's not very complicated. So I'll move on to the next one. So will they give us a formula sheet? No, you will not get a formula sheet. Yeah, you'll just substitute the values. That's about all. You just have to know the equation. If it's given, and there's no guarantee this will be in the exam, by the way, because it's just conceptual. But if it does come, this is how it'll come probably. All right. So this is just a summary of what we just talked about. This is what happens in an action potential, basically. Conductances change. So over here at rest, the conductance of sodium over here is low. Why is the conductance of sodium low? It's because the sodium channels are closed. There are no sodium channels. So it's almost 0. It's almost zero. G of sodium is almost zero. There's no conductance, no channels open. Remember, G equals channels. Channels. How many channels are open? Open channels. This is what G is. Open channels. I is ions moving. Ions moving. They both start with an I. Ions move. And this is the membrane potential, and this is the equilibrium potential. This is the direction to where the ions will move. The direction of the movement of ions. That's it. Now, all it's showing here is that when the action potential is triggered, we mentioned that the sodium channels open over here. Sodium channels open. This means that the conductance of sodium becomes very high. And that means there's an inward current of sodium. Sodium will start to come into the cell. Over here, over here, over here, over here. It'll start coming in. And this raises the potential of the membrane potential because the cell is becoming more positive. There's positive entering the cell. Positive entering the cell. Eventually, once we reach the peak over here, or the overshoot, the potassium channels will open. And this causes the potassium conductance to rise. And this potassium conductance will cause potassium to leave the cell. And when positive ions leave the cell, it'll make the cell much more negative, which is why it pushes back the membrane potential back to the negative. It makes the cell repolarize. So it depolarized over here, and it's now repolarizing. The reason we have repolarization is so we can return to the resting membrane potential in order to cut the signal. We don't want the cell to be depolarized all the time. That's why there is a repolarization. And I want you to remember one thing, one very specific thing about the slide. Remember that at rest, the conductance of the conductance of potassium is higher than sodium. At rest, if you take a look over here, this is at rest again, it's higher. The conductance of sodium is only higher during the upstroke or over here. I'll discuss the different phases of action potential in just a second. But it's only higher over here when the sodium channels open. Any other point, the potassium conductance is higher. If you take a look. This is what you need to remember about this slide. This over here, this segment over here. Over here. Just remember when the conductance of each is higher during the phases of action potential. All right. I don't see any questions in chat, so I'll move on. All right, now it's just the action potential. This is a very easy part. We'll get through it very quickly. All right, so action potential, as we mentioned, is triggered by graded potentials. So there are graded potentials over here that push the threshold upward, that push the membrane potential upwards. Once we reach threshold, once the stimulus reaches this point over here, number 3, once we reach this point, this causes opening of voltage-gated sodium channels. Once voltage-gated sodium channels open, this causes sodium to rush into the cell, they enter the cell. Can you recall what was subthreshold? Subthreshold is just a graded potential that will not trigger the action potential. That's it. Subthreshold, graded potential, will not trigger action potential. Will not action potential. That's it. That's all it means. And you can check out the recording later if you want to revise it. Anyways, so this is the sodium channels open. P means permeability in this case. So the permeability to sodium is higher. That means sodium can now enter the cell, which makes the cell more positive until we reach this point over here. Once we reach this point over here, the inactivation gate closes. If you remember what the inactivation gate, do you guys remember what the inactivation gate was?
Yes.
Yep, great. So it closes over here and it prevents sodium from entering the cell. At this point, at the same time, the potassium channels open up. And this is in order for it to bring down the membrane potential back to the negative values over here, back to the resting membrane potential. And yeah, this is the cycle of an action potential over here. Once we reach this point, the voltage-gated potassium channels close because you no longer need to bring down the potassium. You no longer need to bring down the membrane potential, and this allows the cell to return to resting membrane potential state. And this is the stages of an action potential. Let's revise them just a second. So again, inward current depolarizes the membrane potential. Inward current. Depolarization causes opening of voltage-gated channels over here. It's going to open voltage-gated channels. Remember, these depolarizations are graded potentials. Graded potential. This is graded potential. Then it triggers the opening of voltage-gated channels. This opening of voltage-gated channels will push the membrane potential upwards over here until we reach this point. At number 5, the inactivation gate closes, and then the potassium channel is open. Potassium rushes out of the cell, which makes it more negative, and it pushes it back to the resting membrane potential. And there's some specific terminology you need to know because they'll ask you about it. So just know that what do we call it? The overshoot over here, the overshoot is the point at which we cross 0. So this is 0 over here. This is the overshoot when the membrane potential is above 0. This is all it means. This is the overshoot. They added some things over here. So these are just specific toxins. Tetrodotoxin is a toxin found in pufferfish. It's a neurotoxin. It basically blocks this channel over here, the sodium voltage-gated channel. So it'll block this phase over here. It blocks number 4. What happens is that action potential can no longer be generated because there's no sodium channel to open, there's no upstroke. So an action potential cannot happen. Lidocaine does the exact same thing, but it's a local anesthetic. It's a local anesthetic. At 0.6, at 0.6, potassium channels open. Let me delete the ink off the slide. Potassium channels open at 0.6. Over here, you see? Potassium channels open. It says higher permeability to potassium. Potassium channel open, potassium leaves the cell, and this, because it's leaving the cell, positive ions are leaving the cell, which is making the cell more negative. It's pushing back the membrane potential towards the negative volts over here. Take a look, it's more negative. And then we will return back to resting membrane potential. The overshoot, it happens once the membrane potential crosses 0. You see 0 over here? All this part over here is called the overshoot. This is the overshoot over here, all of this. At 0.5, the inactivation gate is, it's closed. The inactivation gate is closed or activated, whatever you want to call it. So inactivation gate closed. It closes the channel. That's why they call it inactivation gate closes. It's a gate that closes the channel. In between 4 and 5, yeah. All right, next slide. Let's try to finish. All right, so again, can you repeat 0.5, the last 2 lines of the slide? All right, yeah, sure. So number 5, there is what happens between 6 and 7. This is, in 6 and 7, there's still potassium coming in. It's just more potassium is coming in. But because potassium channels take a while to close, sometimes there's an overshoot. That means the potassium just leaves way too much, and this causes the membrane potential to be more negative. This is what happens. But the potassium channels are still open over here. They're still open. And 0.5. So tetrodotoxin is a pufferfish toxin. It's a neurotoxin that inhibits the sodium voltage-gated channels over here. Point number 4. It inhibits these. If these don't work, that means that the action potential will not happen because this can't happen. The sodium cannot enter the cell because the channel is blocked. The same thing happens with lidocaine. Tetrodotoxin and lidocaine do the exact same thing. The only difference is this is a drug that you give to patients. This is a toxin you get from eating pufferfish. That's it. And this is a voltage, and they inhibit voltage-gated sodium channels. You need to know this. Tetrodotoxin, lidocaine, voltage-gated channel inhibition. And they stop action potentials. Next. All right. So this is just a revision over here. Depolarization closes the inactivation gate. This is point number 5. We said the inactivation gate closes, which basically means that the sodium can no longer come into the cell. At this point, potassium channel opens. Now there's a specific, I think, drug or toxin called tetraethyl ammonium, or T, that blocks these voltage-gated potassium channels. You see over here, All this means is that there's a specific drug over here that blocks these channels. And this is just clinical correlation. They're just trying to show you that, yeah, you can block these channels. And what happens when you block these channels is that the action potential will last much longer. So let me pull out a pen. How would lidocaine affect the graph? Lidocaine will not allow the graph to happen. So like a graded potential will reach here and go down. It will not trigger an action potential. This is what lidocaine does. I think I went to the previous slide. What T does, or tetraethylammonium, it blocks these. When it blocks these, that means the cell stays more positive. So when the cell is more positive, that means it's depolarized for a longer period of time. So it takes longer to reach resting membrane potential. That's what happens. And obviously this means that action potentials cannot be triggered because of something we'll discuss in just a second, the refractory periods. So conductance of sodium remains higher at rest after some time, and the membrane potential goes back to normal. Again, conductance of sodium at resting membrane potential, conductance of potassium at resting membrane potential is higher than sodium. That's why the resting membrane potential is close to the equilibrium potential of potassium. All right. Does T cause tetany? I'm not exactly sure. I don't think it causes tetany because tetany has to do with hyper and hypokalemia. And basically it causes the threshold potential to be higher or lower. I don't think it has anything to do with tetany. All right, this is just a revision. So tetany is basically tetany is basically a cell that's very excitable, that you can trigger action potentials a lot. Like for example, if it's in a muscle, tetany is when the muscle spasms way too much. This is what tetany is in this case. And it's because of like electrolyte imbalances, like potassium is too low, potassium is too high, calcium is too low. Yeah. Hyperkalemia, hypokalemia. I think it was discussed in the previous lecture. I'm not sure. I'm not exactly sure. Yep. Okay. Perfect. Let's just delete all this. You just have to memorize it. You just need to know what hypo and hyper. What's the difference between hyperpolarization and repolarization? So hyperpolarization is just a term, like what do we call it? So repolarization, like this whole thing is called repolarization until it goes down. Hyperpolarization is this point over here. It's part of repolarization. It's this point over here when it goes under the resting membrane potential. We see this is the resting membrane potential. It gets hyperpolarized under. That's it. Hyperpolarization. All right. It's because of the reason hyperpolarization happens is because potassium takes a longer period. Potassium channels just take a longer period of time until they close. That's all. All right. So let's discuss the last point of the lecture, and I think we're done. What? So the do hyperkalemia. Sorry, I didn't understand that. So yeah, that's yeah. If you're talking about tetany, yeah, it is. It's either due to hypo or hyperkalemia. I don't remember exactly. You can have a look at your previous lecture to check. All right. So one last thing before we end this review. There's a concept called refractory period. Is it discussed later in the slide or is it just here? Let me check. No, it is here. Okay, perfect. I'll just switch back and forth between these two slides. All right, so there's something called absolute refractory period and there's something called relative refractory period. All refractory period means is that all it means is that it's the period in which no other action potential can be triggered. This is absolute. In absolute refractory period, it's the point at which no action potential can be triggered. No action potential, regardless. Say we have a graded potential of 1 billion. It won't trigger the action potential because it's still in the absolute refractory period. Now, do you know why the absolute refractory period is absolute? It's because of the inactivation gate we discussed earlier. So there's an inactivation gate for sodium, we mentioned, and it closes the channel. And this inactivation gate, because this inactivation gate keeps the channel closed, it causes, what do we call it? Because, can you give me a second, please? Someone's knocking on the door. Just 1 second, I'll be back. All right, sorry about that, I'm back. All right, so where was it? Let's see. What was I talking about? All right, so yeah, inactivation gate. This inactivation gate remains closed and it blocks sodium from coming in until the resting membrane potential goes down to the negative. So this thing will stay on the channel until it reaches the negative portion. That's why during this portion, there's an absolute refractory period. But then after this inactivation gate goes away or opens up, it causes the, what do we call it? It allows for the sodium channels to allow them to open again, basically. The relative refractory period, the reason that happens is not because of the inactivation gate. First off, the relative refractory period is what happens. Like basically, the relative refractory period is you need a stronger stimulus than normal to trigger action potential. That's all it means. So I think it's written over here. Let me check. Begins at the end. Yeah, larger than usual inward current. Basically, you need a larger graded potential. So remember the graded potential, you need a very strong one in order to trigger an action potential in the relative refractory period. That's all it means over here. And this happens because potassium is causing a lot of, like, you see the membrane potential over here, it's very negative. So you need more positive in order to reach the threshold. And that's why the relative refractory period happens in this case. And yeah, that's about all really. Let me just double check that I covered everything. Is there any confusion about action potential refractory periods? Any confusion here? Yeah. Someone was going to ask something. No? Okay. All right. Basically, is there a chat? How can they ask a question about it? Can you be our professor? Yeah. Unfortunately, I cannot. All right. Let's see. How can they ask you a question about it? So basically, what do we call it? They might ask you why this happens. So they'll ask you in an MCQ question, could be an MCQ question. Is there any notes for all physiology block of foundation block overall? I'm not sure. Please summarize the refractory period once again. So yeah, I'll summarize it right now. So a question will come as a form of an MCQ or an SAQ, for example. It could be either of both. What they'll ask you is, what's the reason behind the absolute refractory period? Why does it happen? And your reply would be, the inactivation gate is still closed. Inactivation gate is closed. And it does not open until the membrane potential becomes negative. That's it. That's the absolute refractory period. In relative refractory period, all it means is, you see how the, let me clearly, you see how all the, you see how the resting membrane potential over here is much more, the potential, the potential over here is much more negative. It's at almost negative 90 compared to the resting membrane potential. You need more positive, you need more graded potentials in order to trigger an action potential, because it's just further down. That's all it means. You need more current you need more positive to reach the threshold. That's it. And obviously it's caused by the potassium coming in. Can you talk about hyperkalemia and hypokalemia? I'm not exactly sure. I don't know your name. It's just as M. I haven't revised it yet, so I can't really discuss it. I think you can check out your lecture. Absolute refractory period ends the moment the inactivation channel opens up. The moment the inactivation channel opens up. I can email it to you. Yeah, you can ask me again on email. I don't know your name. for hyper and hypokalemia. I put my email at the end of these slides. You can just email me through there, or like
Is
Yeah.
hyperpolarization basically more like the action potential is like more negative? So that's basically due to hyperkalemia because there are more potassium ions.
Hyperpolarization?
Yep.
No. Hyperpolarization is a normal process. There's no hyper or hypokalemia. It just happens. It's just potassium comes into the leaves the cell a lot. That's what it means. There's no hyper or hypokalemia here. It's just potassium leaves a lot, but because the channel takes longer time to close, see, delayed closure, it takes longer time. That means more potassium will keep leaking, even though we reach the resting membrane potential, so it'll cause hyperpolarization. That's it. There's no hyper or hypokalemia. Yeah, sure. I'll send a copy. I'll send it to Raghda, one of the DLCs, and she can forward it to the batch. All right, let's see. Next, I think we finished. This just discusses a quick action potential. Did Dr. Shawaf discuss this with you, by the way? Or did he just glance over it? Was this discussed in the lecture, or was it just glanced over? Because I could explain it. It's okay.
It was
Okay.
discussed.
It was discussed?
Yes.
He asked about it. What causes the plateau? Okay. Basically, it's the same. This action potential is the same. It's just in cardiac muscle. It's in the heart. It's inside the heart. The only difference is that there's calcium over here. There are calcium channels over here. Just a quick reminder, calcium is on the outside or the inside? Where is it more concentrated?
Outside.
Perfect. So because it's on the outside, when it comes in, it causes the cell to be more positive. And that means, like you see over here, potassium channels are opening, but because calcium channels are also opening, they're sort of like fighting each other. They're getting into a fight. They balance each other out, but eventually the calcium channel closes and then the potassium channel continues downward. This plateau happens because of calcium channels. That's all you need to know. Plateau, calcium channel. That's it. You don't need to know why. You don't need to know anything. So just remember, plateau, calcium channel. And it prolongs the action potential. All this does is prolong the action potential, so it prevents tetany in cardiac muscle. You can't have cardiac muscle spasm. You don't want cardiac muscle to spasm. This is why there's a plateau. That's it. And is there any confusion about it before we finish? I think we're done. Any confusion?
No.
All right, perfect. And we're done. I just put a quick question for you all. You can type in chat if you want. So let's see. B is caused by what in this case? What causes B over here? You can type in chat. Yeah, it's called depolarization, but what is it caused by?
Opening of the sodium channels, the activation of sodium channel.
Yep, voltage gated sodium channels. Perfect. And what causes C in this case?
Inactivation.
Sorry?
Membrane being more permeable to potassium.
Yep, that's correct. But it's opening of voltage gated potassium channels, which is more permeable to potassium channels. Yes. And opening of potassium. Yep, that's fine. D, what is D called? What is D called here? D, like this segment over here. Yeah, it's called hyperpolarization. And why does it happen again? Just remind me.
Because the potassium channel take time to close.
Yep, it's just delayed closure of potassium channels. That's it. Yep, too slow to close. And one last question. This is a bit harder. The conductance of which ion is higher at A? Which ion is more responsible for the resting membrane potential, basically? Yep, potassium. And finally, what's E? What is E here?
Threshold.
Yep, it's just the threshold. And yeah, that's it. Well done.